He took poisoned arrows for an alien child, and woke up 30 years later to find her kneeling beside his bed as the Empress of an entire world. The dusk on Veltaris always came down slowly, not like night falling. Like the sky itself was bleeding color. Deep violet clouds stretched across the horizon, while twin moons climbed over the eastern ridges, pale and enormous against the darkening plains. Wind rolled through the canyon systems, carrying the taste of iron dust and dry salt. Somewhere far below, a herd of horned grazers moved like a black river through the bones of an ancient streambed that hadn't held water in centuries. Caleb Vance watched them through the scope of his field binoculars from the ridge above. 34 years old, former military surveyor, widower, contract observer for Human Expeditionary Post 14. A job that mostly involved standing very still in lonely places while governments pretended observation wasn't interference. He wore an old brown field coat faded at the shoulders from years beneath alien suns. His dark hair had started graying at the temples too early. A scar cut along the left side of his jaw from a fight he barely remembered anymore. His eyes looked like the eyes of a man who had spent too long expecting bad news. The carbine slung across his back was old, but maintained carefully, like everything else he owned. The treaty with the Veltharan houses was strict. Humans were guests on Veltaris. Observers only. No involvement in local politics. No contact with native conflicts. No intervention. Ghosts. That was the word the diplomats used. Humans were allowed to exist here as long as they behaved like ghosts. Caleb had followed the rules for 3 years. 3 quiet years tracking migration patterns, geological shifts, weather systems, and herd movements across a world that felt beautiful in the same lonely way graveyards could feel beautiful. It suited him. His wife had died 11 years earlier in a freighter accident above Titan Station. After that, silence had become easier than people. Veltaris had a lot of silence. Then he heard the hooves. Fast. Metal shod. Coming hard through the canyon below. Caleb immediately dropped flat against the ridge rock. Not grazers. Not traders. He eased the carbine off his shoulder and crawled forward on his elbows until he could see into the canyon. A child was running. Barefoot. Small enough that the loose canyon stones kept slipping beneath her steps. Her skin was violet, not the rich royal violet of Veltharan nobility Caleb had seen in official broadcasts, but bruised and dusty from exhaustion. Her silver hair whipped behind her in tangled streaks. Blood ran down one wrist where something had cut deep into the skin. Behind her came 3 mounted riders. Dark hoods, recurved bows already drawn. They weren't rushing. They didn't need to. The canyon dead-ended less than 300 meters ahead. They knew exactly where she was going. Caleb felt his stomach tighten. He checked the distance. Checked the riders. Checked the child. Then the treaty flashed through his head like a warning siren. Do not interfere. Violation meant termination of contract. Permanent blacklisting. Possibly prison. And if the Veltharans decided humanity had violated territorial neutrality, there would be consequences bigger than 1 dead surveyor in a canyon. Caleb knew all of that. Then the first arrow struck the rock beside the girl's foot. She stumbled hard, hit the dirt with both hands, and looked up. Her eyes found him immediately. Violet eyes. Huge with exhaustion. But not crying. Not begging. That was the part Caleb remembered later. She didn't plead for help. She simply saw him. As if she had already accepted nobody was coming. That look hit harder than panic would have. Caleb had exactly 3 seconds to decide. He used one. Then he was moving. He burst over the ridge at a dead sprint. Stop. His voice thundered down the canyon in trade standard. The riders wheeled instantly toward him. Professionals. No hesitation. No confusion. The first arrow struck Caleb's thigh before he reached the canyon floor. Pain exploded upward through his leg. He kept running. The second arrow buried itself low in his ribs. His breath vanished. He fired once. The lead rider flew backward off his mount. Another arrow whipped past Caleb's head. He fired again. Second rider down. The third rider already had another arrow drawn. This one aimed past Caleb. At the child. Caleb saw it happen in slow motion. The bowstring flexing. The arrow leaving the string. The silver-haired child frozen in terror behind him. And Caleb pivoted without thinking. He turned his body between the arrow and the girl. Impact. The arrow punched into his back below the shoulder blade. Another struck his shoulder. Another ripped through his forearm as he raised it instinctively across the child's face. His last shot cracked through the canyon. The final rider fell from the saddle. Then everything went quiet. Just the wind. And the terrified breathing of a child pinned beneath a dying man. Caleb collapsed sideways into the dust. His mouth was already numb. He knew what that meant. Velthrin root poison. Fast. Lethal. No known human antidote. He rolled carefully off the child. She scrambled upright immediately and stared at the arrows protruding from his body. "You bled for me," she whispered. Her trade standard was careful and soft, spoken like someone who had learned the language from books instead of people. Caleb tried to laugh. Blood touched his lips instead. "Don't touch the arrows." But she crawled toward him anyway, small hands trembling. She placed one violet palm beside the wound in his ribs. Something cold moved through him. Not healing. Not enough. Just resistance. Like invisible fingers slowing the poison for a few precious minutes. "Please stay awake," she whispered. Caleb tried to ask her name. What came out barely sounded human. She leaned closer. "Celerina Veltorian," she said carefully. The name meant nothing to Caleb. At the time, he didn't know it belonged to the daughter of a murdered queen. He didn't know half a planet was hunting her. He didn't know entire houses would eventually kneel for her. He only knew she was a frightened child trying desperately to make sure someone remembered her name before she died. "Caleb," he rasped. She repeated it instantly, like she was afraid forgetting it might matter. Then the skimmer arrived. Dr. Amani Okafor exploded out of the vehicle before the landing struts even stabilized. Late 50s. Silver braids. Whipping in the downdraft. Human chief medical officer of Post 14. One of the few humans on Veltaris the locals actually respected. She hit the canyon floor running. Saw the arrows. Saw Caleb's face. And swore quietly. "No antitoxin," she muttered. Caleb nodded weakly. He already knew. "The vault," he whispered. "Cryostasis. The only chance. Freeze the body. Slow the poison. Pray someone found a cure someday." Okafor looked furious at the universe itself. But she nodded. "We move now." Then Caleb grabbed her sleeve weakly. "The kid." Okafor looked toward the child. The little girl sat silently in the dirt beside him. Not crying. Too exhausted for crying. "She's yours?" Okafor asked softly. "No," Caleb managed. She was running. The doctor's expression shifted when she looked into the child's eyes. Then she nodded once. "I'll take care of her." The girl crawled closer as the medics lifted Caleb onto the stretcher. She put both hands gently on either side of his face. "You must wake up," she whispered. Caleb tried to smile. Then darkness swallowed him. The cryo vault at Post 14 was built for emergencies. Glass. Steel. Cold white lighting. Quiet machinery humming beneath the floor. Caleb barely felt them placing him inside. The frost started at his feet. Slowly climbed upward. He couldn't move anymore. Through the glass, he saw the little girl standing beside the vault. One nurse tried to move her. The child bit her hard enough to draw blood. Nobody tried again after that. Caleb forced his lips to move one final time. "Go home, kid." The girl pressed both palms against the glass. Her eyes never left his face. Then the frost consumed everything. 30 years passed. At first, Caleb dreamed nothing. Only cold. Machines working in darkness around him while the galaxy moved on without him. Stations changed ownership. Governments rose and collapsed. People he had once known became old photographs in forgotten drawers. Dr. Okafor signed his medical reports every year for 21 years. Then one year she didn't. Stroke in her sleep. Age 79. The reports continued without her. Subject remained stable. No viable cure. Continue preservation. The vault changed facilities 3 separate times. Nobody expected him to wake up anymore. But somewhere far away on Veltaris, the little girl survived. The poisoning of Queen Lysariel Veltorian had shattered the northern houses. Civil war followed. The child Caleb saved became the center of that war. And every year, no matter what battles waited for her, she visited the frozen human who had bled for her in a canyon. At first she brought flowers, then books, then stories. At 8 years old she read beside the cryo glass because she thought maybe he could still hear her. At 10 she carved a tiny wooden figure of him and wore the edges smooth with her thumbs over the years. At 17 she took the white circlet of her house. At 19 she began the war that would unite Velteron for the first time in 6 centuries. At 23 she became Empress. At 28, she established formal human relations. And through every victory, every assassination attempt, every treaty, every funeral, she returned to the cryo vault. Always. Because a lonely human stranger had once stepped down from a ridge when nobody else would. And she had never forgotten it. The cure arrived 4 months before Caleb woke. Not from humanity, from Cell herself. Researchers in the southern marshes discovered a fungal compound capable of neutralizing the ancient poison. The cure humanity searched for across 30 years had been growing quietly beneath alien wetlands the entire time. Cell ordered Caleb brought home immediately. Not to a hospital, to her palace. Caleb woke slowly, like drowning in reverse. First came pain, then breath, then weight. His fingers twitched. His chest convulsed. Warm air filled lungs that hadn't breathed naturally in 30 years. Lavender. Stone. Sunlight. Not a medical station. He forced his eyes open. A vaulted ceiling stretched above him. Gray stone carved with ancient Veltharan figures. Sunlight spilled through massive windows. An older Veltharan woman sat beside the bed, checking his pulse. Silver braid. Kind eyes. You are safe, Caleb Vance, she said gently. His throat felt shredded. Where? Okafor. The healer's expression softened. She passed many. Years ago. The number 30 still hadn't fully landed in his brain. 30 years. Everyone he knew was gone. His parents. His co-workers. Anyone who might have remembered him as more than a story. He closed his eyes briefly. The healer gave him time. Then footsteps echoed outside the chamber. Not one pair. Many. Measured. Disciplined. The doors opened. 12 guards entered first in ceremonial armor. Then ministers. Standard bearers. Advisors. And finally, a woman in violet and gold. Tall. Graceful. Silver hair braided beneath a pale circlet. Her skin carried the deep royal violet of old Veltharan bloodlines. But it was her eyes that stopped Caleb's heart. The same eyes. The child's eyes. She crossed the chamber slowly. The entire retinue dropped to one knee behind her. But the Empress kept walking until she reached Caleb's bedside. Then she knelt too. Not gracefully. Not ceremonially. Like someone carrying 30 years of weight finally setting it down. Her hands trembled visibly in her lap. Caleb Vance of Earth, she whispered. You took 6 poisoned arrows meant for me. Her voice nearly broke. My people searched 30 years for a way to bring you back. Caleb stared at her silently. The woman lifted her eyes. And suddenly, despite the crown and the guards and the empire surrounding her, she was 6 years old again. Dusty. Terrified. Lost in a canyon. Do you remember me, warm one? She whispered. Caleb swallowed hard. His throat closed. Then somehow he managed. Cell. The Empress laughed through tears instantly. Small. Broken. Real. You remember. You grew. Caleb whispered weakly. That shattered her completely. Cell lowered her forehead against the back of his hand and cried silently while an entire imperial court pretended not to see. Because every person in that room knew the story. The human who bled for the air. The ghost from the canyon. The warm one. Later, Cell told him everything. Her mother poisoned. The 9-day escape. The old hunter named Orin who witnessed the battle and spread the story through the northern tribes. A human had bled for the child heir. A human had chosen her life over his own. The story became legend. Children grew up. Hearing it. So did Cell. I never forgot your face, she admitted quietly one evening beside his recovery bed. I remember every arrow. Caleb listened while she spoke about wars and diplomacy and rebuilding a fractured world. But the part that broke him wasn't the empire. It wasn't the crown. It wasn't the fleets. It was when she quietly admitted, I brought flowers every year. That was when Caleb cried for the first time. Not during the arrows. Not during cryostasis. Not even waking up 30 years late to his own life. But there beside the Empress who had waited for him half her lifetime. Cell didn't mention the tears. She simply reached out and wiped one gently away with her thumb. There is a wing in the palace waiting for you, she said softly. I had it built during the first year of my reign. Caleb looked at her in disbelief. You built me a room? I built you a home, she corrected quietly. Recovery was slow. 30 years in cryostasis left muscles weak and nerves unreliable. A therapist named Kivra spent weeks forcing Caleb to relearn how to stand without collapsing. Cell visited whenever politics allowed. Sometimes in full imperial regalia. Sometimes barefoot before dawn carrying tea she forgot to drink. Slowly, Caleb learned the capital, the palace gardens, the eastern terraces, the city of pale stone and violet glass stretching endlessly beneath the twin moons. And everywhere he went, people recognized him. Not because he was famous, because he mattered to her. Children bowed to him in public plazas. Old veterans touched fists to their chests respectfully. Servants left fresh flowers near his chambers every morning. One day, Sel brought him to the central plaza. At the center stood a bronze statue 3 stories tall. A human kneeling protectively around a small child. 6 arrows in his back. Fresh white flowers surrounded the base. Who replaces them? Caleb asked quietly. A palace attendant named Mirren, Sel replied. She hasn't missed a day in 26 years. Caleb stared at the statue for a very long time. It didn't look exactly like him. It looked like how a child remembered him. And somehow that mattered more. Children approached the plaza while they stood there. Small Veltharan boys and girls. They bowed deeply toward Caleb. One little girl nervously offered him a flower. He crouched carefully to accept it. "Thank you," he whispered. The girl blushed violet and sprinted back toward her teacher. Sel watched him silently beside the statue. "They know your story," she said. Caleb shook his head. "No," he answered quietly. "They know yours." 9 days later, someone tried to assassinate the Empress. The ceremony took place outside the high hall before thousands. Trade delegates, military officials, diplomats. Caleb stood beneath the shaded colonnade watching Sel address the crowd. Then he noticed one delegate move strangely. Too stiff. One sleeve hanging too heavy. Training took over before thought did. Caleb moved instantly. He slammed into the assassin just as the hidden blade emerged. The knife skidded harmlessly across the stone steps. Guards flooded the area. Chaos exploded across the plaza. Sel descended the steps with terrifying calm. "Alive," she ordered coldly. "This concordance is built on law." Only later, alone behind closed doors, did she finally crack. She stood facing away from Caleb. Perfect posture. Perfect control. Then her shoulders trembled once. Just once. Caleb crossed the room quietly and placed a hand between her shoulder blades. Sel turned instantly and buried her forehead against his chest. "I do not want to bury you a second time," she whispered. Caleb wrapped his arms around her carefully. "You won't. That is not a promise." "No," he said softly. "It's a fact." Sel looked up at him slowly. "You are choosing to stay." Caleb realized then that despite everything, the palace, the statues, the empire, the 30 years of waiting, a part of her had still believed he might leave, might decide she belonged to another life now, another world, another species. But Caleb looked down at the woman who had carried his memory through war and loneliness and impossible years, and he realized he already knew the answer. "I'm choosing you," he said quietly. Sel closed her eyes, and for the first time in 30 years, the fear finally left her face. The palace wing waiting for him faced east, toward the same ridges where he first saw a little girl running for her life. Above the doorway, carved simply into the stone, were 2 words, Caleb Vance, no title. No honorific, no legend, just his name. Inside waited books collected across 30 years. Human poetry, historical archives, a preserved copy of Dr. Okafor's essays. And beside the window sat a small glass jar. Inside rested the 6 arrowheads removed from his body. Caleb stared at them for a long time. Then he sat beside the eastern window and watched night settle over the capital. He stayed there until dawn. Sel found him just before sunrise. Barefoot, without her circlet, she sat beside him quietly. Neither spoke. Together they watched light spill slowly across Veltaris. The same world that once nearly killed them both. Now peaceful, alive, changing. The first sunlight touched Sel's silver hair, then her hand beside his. During cryo, Caleb whispered eventually, "I dreamed about you." Sel turned toward him. "I saw your face before I woke up. Older, wearing the crown." Her eyes filled instantly. "I dreamed about you too," she whispered. "For 30 years. Caleb took her hand gently and pressed it against his lips. Below them, the city slowly woke. Somewhere in the plaza, fresh white flowers were already being placed beside the bronze statue. Another ordinary morning in a world forever changed by one impossible act of kindness. Caleb eventually understood something important. The statue wasn't the real monument. Neither was the palace, nor the crown, nor the empire. The real monument was smaller, quieter, A frightened child remembered by a lonely man. A lonely man remembered by a frightened child. One moment of compassion stretching across 30 years of darkness until it became something large enough to reshape an entire world. Because sometimes history does not change through war. Sometimes it changes because one tired man standing on a canyon ridge decides, even for only a few seconds, that another life matters more than his own. Van Bandadon. 1. Txt tai lu viet li ni dong sie with circumflex u twin tun bang ting enhgi engwin ni dong cho gmxcm da with grave I ng 8000 t. He took 6 poisoned arrows for an alien child, and 30 years later, he woke up to find an entire empire waiting for him to open his eyes. The sunset over Veltaris looked like the end of the world. The sky burned violet and crimson above the canyon ridges while cold desert winds swept through the stone valleys below. Twin moons rose slowly behind distant cliffs, pale and enormous against the darkening horizon. Shadows stretched long across the canyon floor like fingers reaching toward night. Caleb Vance lay flat against the ridge rock with binoculars pressed to his eyes, recording herd migration data into a cracked survey tablet that had survived longer than most of the people he used to know. He was 34 years old, too young to look as tired as he did. Former military reconnaissance. Former husband. Current contract observer for Human Expeditionary Post 14. Which sounded more important than it really was. Mostly, it meant long weeks alone in places nobody else wanted to stand, watching alien wildlife and geological shifts while diplomats insisted humanity was building peaceful scientific relations with the Velthran systems. In reality, humans were tolerated on Veltaris only because they stayed out of the way. Observers. Ghosts. The treaty was very clear. No interference in native conflicts. No involvement in internal politics. No exceptions. Caleb had spent 3 years following those rules because rules were easier than people. People left. People died. Rules stayed simple. He adjusted the binoculars toward the canyon floor and froze. Someone was running. Small. Fast. Barefoot. An alien child burst from between 2 canyon walls, slipping on loose stone as she sprinted across the ravine below. Her silver hair whipped wildly behind her. Dust coated her violet skin. One wrist bled badly, staining the torn fabric wrapped around her arm. Behind her came mounted riders. 3 of them. Dark hoods. Velthran hunting bows already drawn. Not chasing. Herding. They knew exactly where the canyon ended. Caleb immediately checked distances out of instinct. 300 meters. Wind cross-current from the west. Riders armored lightly. The child wouldn't make the dead end before they caught her. His hand tightened unconsciously around the old carbine resting beside him. Then the treaty flashed through his mind. Do not interfere. Violation meant immediate termination. Blacklisting. Possibly imprisonment, depending on how badly diplomacy collapsed afterward. And this world was already balancing on fragile political ground. He knew all of that. Then the first arrow struck stone beside the little girl's foot. She stumbled hard and nearly fell. And when she looked up, her eyes found him instantly. Huge violet eyes. Terrified. Exhausted. But not hopeful. That was what hit him hardest later. She didn't look at him like someone expecting rescue. She looked at him like someone confirming there truly was nobody left who would help. Caleb had 3 seconds to decide whether he cared more about the treaty or the child. He used one. Then he was moving. He came down the ridge at a sprint, boots sliding through loose gravel as he pulled the carbine from his shoulder. Stop! His voice thundered through the canyon. The riders wheeled toward him immediately. Professional reaction. No surprise. No hesitation. The first arrow struck Caleb in the thigh before he reached the canyon floor. Pain exploded upward through his leg. He kept running. Second arrow. Low ribs. Hard enough to spin him sideways. He fired once. One rider vanished backward off the mount. The second rider loosed another arrow. It ripped through Caleb's coat sleeve. He fired again. Second rider dropped. The third rider already had another arrow drawn. Not at Caleb. At the child. Caleb saw the arrow leave the string. Saw the girl frozen behind him. And without thinking, he turned. The arrow slammed into his back beneath the shoulder blade. Another struck his shoulder. A third punched through his forearm as he instinctively raised it to shield the child's face. His final shot cracked through the canyon. The last rider collapsed from the saddle. Then silence returned all at once. Wind. Dust. The frightened breathing of a little alien girl beneath the body of a dying human. Caleb collapsed sideways into the dirt. His mouth was already numb. That was bad. Very bad. Velphrin root poison. Fast-acting neurotoxin. No known human cure. The child scrambled toward him immediately, small hands shaking violently. "You bled for me," she whispered. Her trade standards sounded careful and fragile, like someone who learned the language alone. Caleb tried to laugh. Blood filled his mouth instead. "Don't touch the arrows," but she ignored him. The little girl placed one trembling hand beside the wound in his ribs. Cold spread through him instantly. Not healing. Not enough for that. But something slowed. The poison stopped racing quite so quickly through his veins. A few extra minutes. Maybe less. Her eyes filled with panic. "Please stay awake." Caleb tried to ask her name. The words barely worked. She leaned close enough that silver hair brushed his face. "Celerina Valtorian," she whispered. The name meant nothing to him then. He didn't know he was bleeding in the dirt beside the heir to one of the oldest royal bloodlines on Veltaris. He didn't know her mother had been assassinated 6 days earlier. He didn't know half the planet was searching for her. He only knew a terrified child was trying desperately to make sure someone remembered who she was before she disappeared forever. "Caleb," he rasped weakly. She repeated it immediately, like forgetting it would matter somehow. Then engine noise echoed through the canyon. A medical skimmer descended hard between the cliffs, blasting dust in every direction. Dr. Amani Okafor jumped out before the landing gear fully settled. Late 50s. Silver braids. Sharp eyes. Chief medical officer for Post 14. One of the few people on Veltaris Caleb actually trusted. She took one look at the arrows and swore under her breath. "No antitoxin," she muttered instantly. Caleb nodded weakly. He already knew. "The vault," he whispered. "Cryostasis. The only chance left. Freeze him. Slow the poison. Pray someone discovered a cure before his body gave out permanently." Okafor looked furious. Not at Caleb. At the universe. But she nodded. "We move now." Then Caleb caught her sleeve weakly. "The kid." Okafor looked toward the little girl kneeling beside him. The child sat perfectly still now, both hands stained with Caleb's blood. "She yours?" Okafor asked softly. "No, you know who she is?" "No." The doctor studied the child for another second. Then something in her expression changed. "I'll take care of her," she promised quietly. The little girl crawled closer as the medics lifted Caleb onto the stretcher. She pressed both hands gently against his face. "You must wake up," she whispered. Caleb tried to smile. The world disappeared before he finished. The cryostasis chamber beneath Post 14 looked more like a tomb than medical equipment. White lights, steel walls, cold vapor drifting across the floor, machines humming softly in the dark. Caleb barely felt them lowering him into the chamber. Frost began creeping upward across the glass. His body had stopped responding correctly. His chest felt heavy. Numbness crawled through his veins like ice water. Outside the chamber, the little girl stood silently beside Dr. Okafor. A medic tried to guide her away once. The child bit him hard enough to draw blood. Nobody tried again. Caleb forced his eyes toward her through the thickening frost. She looked impossibly small standing there. Silver hair tangled, clothes torn, still covered in his blood. He used the last strength he had left to move his lips. "Go home, kid." The girl pressed both palms against the freezing glass. Then the frost swallowed everything. 30 years passed. At first, Caleb dreamed nothing. No sound, no memory, only endless cold. The galaxy moved on without him. Post 14 changed commanders twice. Trade routes shifted. Governments collapsed. Wars started and ended. People he once knew became names on archived files nobody opened anymore. Dr. Okafor signed his medical report every year for 21 years. Subject stable. No viable antitoxin found. Continue preservation. Then 1 year her signature stopped appearing. Stroke. Peaceful death. Age 79. The reports continued without her. Mostly because nobody wanted responsibility for terminating a man frozen between life and death. So Caleb remained sleeping in the vault while the universe forgot him. Except one person didn't. Every year, a young Veltharan woman visited the cryostasis chamber. At first she brought flowers, white canyon lilies, then books, then recordings. When she was 8 years old, She sat beside the cryo chamber and read stories aloud because she believed he might still hear her somehow. At 10, she learned human trade standard properly so she could speak to him without stumbling over words. At 12, she carved a small wooden figure of him and kept it hidden beneath her pillow for years. At 16, she survived her first assassination attempt. At 18, she united 3 fractured northern houses through diplomacy and blood. At 23, she took the imperial circlet. At 26, she became the first Veltharan empress in 600 years. Entire fleets moved at her command. Worlds bent knee beneath her rule. Empires negotiated carefully when she entered a room. But every single year, no matter how powerful she became, she returned to the cryostasis vault. Because 30 years earlier, when she was alone and hunted and terrified in a canyon, a tired human stranger had chosen her life over his own, and she had never forgotten his face. The cure was discovered almost by accident. Deep marsh fungi from southern Veltaris contained an enzyme capable of neutralizing the root poison at suspended metabolic temperatures. Human science had failed for decades. An alien wetland solved it quietly in the dark. The moment researchers confirmed the results, the Empress personally ordered Caleb transferred to the palace medical wing. Not a hospital, not a research facility. Home. Caleb woke slowly. Pain came first, then gravity, then air. Warm air filled lungs that had not breathed naturally in 30 years. He coughed violently. His fingers twitched weakly against soft blankets. Lavender. Sunlight. Stone. Not a cryostasis facility. He forced his eyes open. The ceiling above him arched high with carved gray stone etched in ancient Veltharan patterns. Golden light spilled through tall windows across polished floors. Somewhere nearby, water trickled softly. An elderly Veltharan healer sat beside the bed, checking monitors. When she noticed his eyes open, her expression softened instantly. "You are safe, Caleb." "Vance," she said gently. His throat felt shredded. "Where am I?" "The Imperial Palace." That made no sense. He swallowed painfully. "Dr. Okafor?" Sadness crossed the healer's face. She passed many years ago. The number 30 still hadn't fully reached him yet. 30 years. Everyone he knew was either dead or old enough not to recognize him anymore. His parents, friends, co-workers, anyone connected to the life he remembered, gone. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. The healer let him sit in silence. Then footsteps echoed outside the chamber. Many footsteps. Measured. Disciplined. The doors opened. Guards entered first. Tall armored Veltharans carrying ceremonial spears. Then ministers. Advisors. Nobles. An entire imperial procession. And finally, a woman wearing violet and gold. She moved with quiet authority that shifted the entire room around her. Silver hair braided elegantly over one shoulder. Pale circlet resting against her brow. Deep violet skin touched softly by sunlight through the windows. But Caleb barely noticed any of that. Because her eyes were the same. The same eyes from the canyon. The woman crossed the chamber slowly. Everyone behind her dropped to one knee. Then the Empress herself knelt beside Caleb's bed. Not gracefully, not politically, like someone finally setting down a weight she'd carried too long. Her hands trembled. "Caleb Vance of Earth," she whispered. "You took 6 poisoned arrows meant for me." Her voice nearly broke. "My people searched 30 years for a way to bring you back." Caleb stared at her silently. The Empress lifted her eyes toward him. And suddenly, she wasn't an Empress anymore. She was a frightened 6-year-old child kneeling in canyon dust beside a dying man. "Do you remember me, warm one?" she whispered softly. Caleb swallowed hard. His throat tightened painfully. Then somehow he managed one word. "Cell?" The Empress laughed through tears instantly. "Small. Broken. Real. You remember," she whispered. "You grew," Caleb said weakly. That shattered her completely. Cell lowered her forehead against his hand and cried quietly, while an entire imperial court pretended not to notice. Because every person in that room knew the story. The warm one. The ghost of the canyon. The human who bled for the child heir. Later, Cell told him everything. Her mother poisoned during peace negotiations. The northern houses descending into civil war. Her 9-day escape across the canyon territories. The old hunter who witnessed Caleb's sacrifice and spread the story throughout the tribes. A human stranger had chosen the heir's life over his own. That story became legend. Children grew up hearing it. So did Cell. I never forgot your face, she admitted quietly one evening while sitting beside his recovery bed. I remember every arrow. Caleb listened while she explained how she united the Velthran systems, how diplomacy failed until war became unavoidable, how she spent years building an empire from fractured worlds. But the part that truly broke him wasn't the politics. It wasn't the fleets. It wasn't the crown. It was when she quietly said, I brought flowers every year. That was when Caleb finally cried. Not during the arrows. Not during cryostasis. Not even waking up 30 years after his own life ended. But there beside the woman who waited for him across 3 decades. Sel didn't mention the tears. She simply reached forward and wiped one gently away with her thumb. There is a wing prepared for you, she said softly. I had it built during my first year as Empress. Caleb stared at her. You built me a room? I built you a home. Recovery took months. 30 years frozen in cryostasis left muscles weak and nerves unreliable. Some mornings Caleb couldn't walk across the chamber without assistance. The palace healer, Kivra, pushed him relentlessly. Sel visited whenever her duties allowed, sometimes dressed in full imperial regalia surrounded by guards, sometimes barefoot before dawn carrying tea she barely touched. Slowly Caleb learned the palace, the eastern terraces, the gardens filled with glowing violet flowers beneath moonlight, the massive capital city stretching endlessly beneath the palace cliffs. And everywhere he went, people recognized him. Not because he was famous, because he mattered to her. Children bowed when they saw him. Servants smiled nervously around him. Old soldiers touched closed fists against their chests respectfully. One afternoon, Sel brought him to the central plaza. At its center stood a bronze statue nearly 3 stories tall. A human kneeling protectively around a small child. 6 arrows buried in his back. Fresh white flowers surrounded the base. Caleb stopped walking. Every day, he asked quietly. Sel nodded. A palace attendant named Mirren replaces them each morning. For how long? 26 years. Caleb stared at the statue silently. It didn't look exactly like him. It looked like how a frightened child remembered him. And somehow that mattered more. A group of schoolchildren noticed him standing there. They froze instantly. Whispering spread through the group. One little Velthran girl nervously approached carrying a white flower. Caleb crouched carefully despite the ache in his knees. The child handed him the flower with trembling hands. Thank you, she whispered shyly. Caleb accepted it gently. Then the girl sprinted back toward her classmates with violet cheeks. Sel watched him quietly beside the statue. They know your story, she said softly. Caleb shook his head. No, he answered. They know yours. 9 days later, someone tried to assassinate the Empress. The attack happened during a diplomatic ceremony outside the High Hall. Thousands attended. Trade delegates, military officers, foreign representatives. Caleb stood beneath the colonnade watching Sel address the crowd when he noticed one delegate moving strangely. Too stiff. Right sleeve weighted unnaturally. Training took over instantly. Caleb moved before conscious thought caught up. He slammed into the assassin just as the hidden blade emerged. The knife skidded harmlessly across stone. Guards exploded into motion. Chaos swept the plaza. Sel descended the steps with terrifying calm. Alive, she ordered coldly. This concordance is governed by law. Only later, behind closed doors, did her composure finally crack. She stood facing away from Caleb in her private chambers. Perfect posture. Perfect stillness. Then her shoulders trembled once. Just once. Caleb crossed the room quietly and rested a hand between her shoulder. Blades. Sel turned immediately and pressed her forehead against his chest. I do not want to bury you a second time, she whispered. Caleb wrapped his arms around her carefully. You won't. That is not a promise. No, he said softly. It's a fact. Sel looked up at him slowly. You are choosing to stay. Caleb realized then that despite everything, the palace, the stories, the 30 years of waiting, some part of her still feared he might leave, might decide this world belonged to another life, another species, another future. But Caleb looked down at the woman who had carried his memory through war and loneliness and impossible years, and he already knew the answer. I'm choosing you, he whispered. For the first time since waking, the fear left her face completely. The palace wing prepared for Caleb faced east toward the canyon territories where they first met. Above the doorway, carved simply into pale stone, were 2 words, Caleb Vance, no titles. No heroic inscription, just his name. Inside waited shelves of books collected across 30 years. Human poetry, old Earth history, music archives, a preserved copy of Dr. Okafor's journals. And beside the eastern window,